What if the person sitting next to you right now, like maybe they're just eating a fast food burger, casually scrolling through their phone on the bus? What if they aren't just, living a different lifestyle than you?
Right. What if they're fundamentally something else?
Exactly. What if they are actually a completely different, like, lower species of human? That is the terrifying, hyper-elitist, and just, frankly, uncompromising premise of today's deep dive. We are looking at a world that is totally stripped of all nuance, divided into this strict, absolute binary.
Yeah, it's a lens that really forces you to reevaluate, well, every single interaction you have in public. When you strip away all the gray areas of human behavior, the psychology, the socioeconomic backgrounds, you're left with this very stark, very brutal philosophical architecture.
Yeah, it really is. And welcome to another deep dive, by the way. Our source material today is this highly intense, deeply philosophical video transcript that just aggressively deconstructs modern society. I mean, it divides all of humanity into two absolute categories, the enlightened thinkers and the base primitives.
Which is a heavy concept right out of the gate.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And before we go any further, I really need to lay down a crucial disclaimer for you listening. This text contains extreme, provocative, and highly politically charged viewpoints.
Yeah, very extreme.
We are talking about incredibly harsh critiques of democracy, modern lifestyles, and just average, everyday people. So our mission today is to act strictly as your impartial guides to this text. We aren't endorsing these views, and we aren't condemning them either. We are just going to, break down the mechanics of this specific worldview.
Right, just mapping out its logic exactly as it's presented in the source so you can understand what this philosophy is actually arguing.
Exactly.
Which is a fascinating exercise, honestly, because understanding a radically different perspective on human existence, regardless of how jarring or, offensive it might be to modern sensibilities, that's exactly how we stress test our own understanding of society.
Totally. So let's build the foundation here. According to this text, we have the thinker and the primitive. And the author doesn't just, invent these out of thin air.
Yeah.
They pull from some very heavy, very ancient philosophical frameworks to define them. We're talking Pythagorean, Platonic, and ancient Gnostic traditions.
Yeah, the Gnostic influence is really the skeleton key for this entire text. The author refers to the thinker in a Gnostic sense as a pneumatic. And this is a profoundly intellectual, spiritually inspired being. The defining characteristic of the thinker is their absolute, uncompromising sacrifice for the optimization of humanity.
Well, hold on. Before we throw around terms like Gnostic, let's just make sure we are all on the same page. My understanding of ancient Gnosticism is essentially the belief that the physical material world is a flawed, corrupt prison.
Yes, exactly.
Like the body, physical desires, the earth itself, it's all a trap. And the only way to free yourself is through pure, elevated, spiritual or intellectual knowledge. The divine spark is trapped in the meat suit, so to speak.
That is the perfect summary. And it explains, well, everything about how the thinker operates in this text. Because they view the material world as a trap, their entire existence is oriented toward a higher, non-physical purpose.
Right.
And the text is incredibly specific about what this sacrifice looks like in practice. The thinker will deliberately ignore, the most vibrant social gatherings, completely turn away from romance or physical pleasure, just to stay isolated at a computer calculating physical processes to advance civilization.
Wow.
Yeah, or they will spend years learning dead languages simply to extract a single lost philosophical truth from an ancient manuscript.
I mean, the text even brings up Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the famous early rocket scientist, as the ultimate archetype here. He was known for dressing bizarrely, looking almost comical to the people around him. But the text argues he didn't dress that way out of incompetence. He dressed that way because his mind was literally elsewhere.
Right, calculating orbital mechanics.
Exactly. He couldn't care less about societal standards of fashion or the fleeting trends of his neighborhood. It sounds like the thinker is the ultimate obsessed IT guy who ignores a fire alarm because he's in the middle of writing code that could save the world, while everyone else is just worried about the office pizza party.
That's actually a great way to put it. That disregard for the physical world is the absolute hallmark of the pneumatic. Now, contrast that with the other side of this binary, the primitive.
Right, the primitives.
The source defines primitives as individuals who were given the great gift of a mind by the gods, but actively chose to sacrifice it. They traded their divine spark, their intellect, for base animalistic desires. Eating, mating, and mindless entertainment.
And I really want to highlight a crucial point the text makes here, because it's easy to misunderstand. This division is not about class. It's not about how much money you make.
Right, not at all.
The author explicitly states that a primitive can be anyone from a homeless person sleeping on the street all the way up to a sitting president. It is an internal state of being, an orientation of the soul, not a tax bracket.
And this creates a massive psychological friction. The text argues that primitives are, on some level, subconsciously terrified of deep thought. Because they have abandoned their own intellect, they simply cannot process what they are looking at when they see a thinker lost in deep concentration.
They don't see genius.
Exactly. They see a glitch in the matrix.
Which means they start projecting their own chaotic mindset onto the thinker, right? Like, if the primitive only values physical pleasure and they see someone ignoring physical pleasure to read a book on theoretical physics, the primitive assumes, well, they must be on drugs, or they are mentally ill.
Or they are plotting a crime.
Yeah.
They cannot comprehend the act of thinking for the sake of thinking. It just registers as anomalous and threatening behavior.
Let's ground this in a real scenario, because the text gives this highly specific, almost cinematic example of how this plays out in a one-on-one interaction. It describes a, quote, primitive woman trying to interact with one of these thinkers.
Yeah, this part is fascinating.
She approaches him maybe looking to flirt, or just looking for standard social validation. But she just hits a brick wall.
She is immediately disoriented because he lacks all the physical markers she relies on to categorize a male in her reality.
Wow.
He doesn't wear cologne, he doesn't smell like cigarette smoke, and most baffling to her, he displays what the text calls total sexual inertia.
Right.
He shows absolutely zero interest in her flirting.
And because he doesn't fit into any of her pre-existing mental boxes, her brain just starts short-circuiting, making these wild, absurd leaps. She assumes he must be secretly gay. Or because her worldview is entirely shaped by media consumption, she starts comparing him to movies.
Oh yeah, she wonders if he's a metrosexual vampire or a wizard.
A wizard, or some kind of alien in human form.
It's a defense mechanism, really. Attributing supernatural or completely absurd traits to him is psychologically easier for her to believe. It's easier to think he's a vampire than to accept that he operates on a higher intellectual plane that she simply cannot access.
That makes sense.
And once she categorizes him as broken, she decides she needs to fix him. She offers to take him to a barber, buy him normal clothes, and even offers him a loan to pay for it all. She wants to forcibly mold him into a standard, recognizable guy.
And this is where the text takes a massive swing that really caught my attention. A normal person reading that interaction might think the woman is just being a bit overbearing, maybe socially clumsy.
Right, it's awkward.
Yeah. And the thinker, you could argue, is the one lacking basic social grace. But the text frames her offer of a haircut as a hostile attack. It literally compares her speaking to him to a robbery, an act of unprovoked violence.
It is intense.
Wait, so is the thinker actually superior here, or just lacking basic social grace? Why does the author interpret a mundane social interaction as an act of war?
It goes right back to the Gnostic concept of the flesh as a prison, and time as the only resource to escape it. For the thinker, mental energy is a sacred resource dedicated entirely to human progress. Any distraction, even a well-meaning offer to go to the mall, is a theft of that resource.
Wow.
The text argues that the true tragedy is the primitive's absolute inability to conceive of a life dedicated to a single, overarching idea spanning decades.
The source uses a brilliant word for the primitive's lifestyle. It calls it kaleidoscopic.
Yes, the primitive lives a chaotic, kaleidoscopic existence, constantly shifting focus, bouncing from one physical distraction to the next. And because they can't fathom focusing on a goal for 30 years, they assume the thinker's isolation is just a temporary mistake that needs correcting.
Right. They completely fail to realize the thinker is actively, intentionally rejecting what the author calls the rotten values of their civilization.
Exactly.
It's a great setup for an analogy. Imagine two people sitting at a table to play a board game. The thinker is playing a massive, multi-tiered game of 3D chess, plotting moves 20 turns in advance. Okay. The primitive sits down at the exact same table and starts aggressively playing Hungry Hippos, just slamming the lever as fast as possible to consume marbles.
That is a very vivid image.
The primitive isn't just playing a different game. The chaotic slamming is actively shaking the table, knocking over the chess pieces, and destroying the thinker's strategy. They aren't even operating in the same reality.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of the conflict. The strategy of the thinker is highly vulnerable to the chaos of the primitive. And the text actually scales this concept up from a one-on-one interaction into a micro-society, using this incredibly vivid allegory about a communal apartment.
Oh, I loved this part. I want you listening to imagine this scenario, especially if you've ever had a terrible roommate situation. The text asks us to imagine a shared living space with 10 people, one thinker and 9 primitives, specifically 5 villagers and 4 urbanites.
And the thinker, driven by their nature to optimize, immediately looks at the dilapidated apartment and tries to improve the infrastructure for everyone. They set out to install a boiler for hot water and wire the entire place for internet access.
You would think the roommates would be thrilled. But the primitives violently resist. They argue they are perfectly fine washing in the rain or dumping cold buckets of water over their heads. They actively despise the idea of the internet. Their only goals are to drink alcohol, eat fatty foods, and play cards.
And the resistance is completely fueled by paranoia. The text points out that the primitives immediately start spouting media-driven conspiracy theories. They claim the 5G internet is going to control their minds, or that the router is somehow connected to GMOs.
GMOs in the router.
Yeah, or that it will cause them to lose their physical potency. The author really highlights the dark irony here. They fear the technology will destroy their bodies while they are actively destroying their own health with cheap vodka and cigarettes.
Despite the harassment, though, the thinker pushes through and builds the infrastructure. And this leads to the breaking point of the allegory, which is just so telling about how the author views resource management. The thinker installs a specialized 4-plug electrical socket. It is meticulously calculated. The wiring is designed to handle exactly the amperage of the thinker's specific technological needs and nothing more.
But the primitives, who spent weeks protesting the technology, inevitably decide they want to use it for their own physical comfort. They take a heavy-duty space heater and a massive electric kettle and jam them into the sockets.
Because of course they do. The thinker built the system with exact mathematical precision. The primitives operate on boundless, chaotic consumption. When they plug in the kettle and the heater, the system overloads, the socket violently burns out, the infrastructure is destroyed.
And how do the primitives react?
They blame the thinker for building a faulty socket.
It is the ultimate expression of the hungry Hippos player destroying the chessboard and then blaming the chess player for the mess.
It's the ultimate group project nightmare, just scaled up to infrastructure. You do all the work, your team actively sabotages it because they don't understand mechanics, and when it catches fire, they point the finger at you. Reading this, my immediate thought was, why doesn't the thinker just move out? Why endure the harassment in this apartment?
Because the apartment is a metaphor for Earth.
Oh.
Yeah, the thinker has nowhere else to go. The text describes this daily dynamic as an asymmetrical war for survival. The thinker is forced to share a finite space with a majority that actively despises their differences. The author's conclusion is that primitives are entirely ungrateful for the technological and philosophical resources that thinkers sacrifice their lives to create. They want the warmth of the boiler, but they hate the mind that built it.
Wow. So if that is the underlying mechanism in a 10-person apartment, let's scale it up again. What happens when we apply this philosophy to an entire nation? How does this text view modern political systems?
With absolute violent rejection, particularly when it comes to democracy.
Which I guess makes sense within the text's internal logic. If you firmly believe the world is comprised of 9 primitives for every one thinker, then majority rule isn't freedom. It's a hostage situation.
Exactly. The text argues that because primitives are the overwhelming demographic majority, democracy ceases to be a tool for collective good and instead becomes a mechanism for reverse selection. It mathematically empowers what the text calls the degenerate majority to actively oppress, outvote, and silence the intellectual minority.
The text actually makes a direct comparison to the movie Ideologies.
It does, yeah.
It argues that democracy is a fast track to that exact dystopian future. A world where base entertainment, junk food, and anti-intellectualism completely override human potential, because that is what the majority will always vote for. The primitives will continually vote for more heaters and kettles until the entire national power grid burns out.
And because the author identifies democracy as a fatal systemic flaw in human evolution, the solutions proposed in the text are, well, they are incredibly severe.
And here is where we need to really maintain our objective analytical distance, because the source goes to a very dark, extreme place. To fix the idiocracy problem, the text argues for a theotechnocratic society.
Right.
It calls for a leader, described almost like a god emperor, who would forcefully mandate human evolution, someone who would drag the masses toward progress, entirely against their own will. It even goes so far as to suggest that a, quote, super COVID-like, a targeted biological plague that wiped out anyone who prioritized bodily pleasure over intellect, would leave behind a purified foundation for a better society.
It advocates for the complete removal of choice.
We've seen historical attempts to force utopian visions from the top down. Taking a step back from the text to look at the mechanics of authoritarianism, those systems almost always collapse. Centralizing all power in one genius fails because a single point of failure simply cannot manage the infinite complexity of human society. It requires a level of control that, historically, results in catastrophe. So how does this text internally justify crossing that line? How does it rationalize advocating for a dictatorship of intellect or a targeted plague?
The author justifies it through a profound sense of existential urgency. The text operates on the premise that humanity, in its current democratic state, is actively destroying its own potential to survive, let alone evolve.
Okay.
The author points out that society has completely redefined the concept of normal. Normal now means drinking alcohol, smoking, and consuming pointless media until you die. In the author's view, humanity is a dying patient on an operating table, suffering from a self-inflicted disease of the mind. Therefore, these extreme non-democratic measures, whether it's a god emperor or a catastrophic biological reset, are not viewed as oppression. They are viewed as the only viable surgery left to save the species from itself.
It is the ultimate, the ends justify the means argument. If the ship is sinking because the majority voted to drill holes in the hull, the text argues the only moral action is to violently seize the wheel. It's incredibly heavy stuff, but what's fascinating is that this philosophy doesn't just stay in the realm of grand political theory.
No, not at all.
The author applies this exact same rigorous, judgmental framework to the most personal daily choices you make, down to, like, what you eat for lunch.
The philosophy of consumption in this text is incredibly detailed, and it circles right back to the Gnostic hatred of the physical body.
The source spends a significant amount of time critiquing modern food. It mocks fast food by using this made-up word, schmuck, which sounds like a stand-in for a Big Mac or a sloppy, mass-produced burger.
Yeah.
It describes modern bread as nothing more than yeast stuffed with mutilated meat left out for flies. And it contrasts all of this garbage with the thinker's ideal diet, which is radically minimalist. A true thinker, the text implies, should be surviving on a handful of berries while calculating physics.
This is where the text introduces three distinct late Gnostic classifications of humanity to explain our consumption habits. We already know the top tier, the pneumatics, the spiritually inspired thinkers eating the berries. Then, at the very bottom, you have the Hylics,
the base materialists. And the text does not mince words here. It compares Hylics to pigs or cows. It says they live entirely tethered to the physical world, driven only by the need to fill their stomachs and reproduce.
But the text introduces a middle tier that is particularly insightful. The psychics. Now, this doesn't mean psychic like, reading minds or bending spoons.
Right.
It means psychic as in related to the psyche or the emotions.
The text describes these psychics as a more subtle, perhaps more dangerous type of materialist. They might not just be chasing a greasy fast food burger. Instead, they're chasing emotional or glandular highs. The text literally calls them endorphin junkies.
That's a great term.
They are still seeking material satisfaction. They're just doing it through brain chemistry, maybe through social media validation, extreme sports, or dramatic relationships, rather than just a full stomach. But crucially, the author argues they are still entirely disconnected from true, higher intellect.
To the author, biting into that fast food burger or doom scrolling for dopamine isn't just a dietary misstep or a bad habit. It is a profound moral failing. It is undeniable proof that you are a Hylic or a psychic, just a slave to your physical vessel.
Wow.
The ultimate dream regarding consumption in this text is actually technological. The author proposes an ideal solution. A device implanted directly into the human stomach.
I found this part so wild. It's an implant that automatically dispenses the exact perfect nutrients, vitamins, and medicines your body needs, constantly scanning and adjusting your chemistry.
Completely bypassing the act of eating altogether. If you remove the physical need to seek out food, prepare food, taste food, and digest food, you entirely remove the distraction of physical pleasure. The mind is finally, permanently freed from the demands of the meat suit, able to work entirely unimpeded on higher optimizations.
It is the absolute ultimate rejection of the human experience as we know it. So what does this all mean for us sitting here in the real world? We have just taken a very intense journey through a deeply polarizing, uncompromising text. We've looked at a worldview that sees the majority of humanity not as equals, but as an obstacle to be managed or even eradicated in the name of progress.
It is an extreme mirror to hold up to society, for sure, but it challenges us to look very closely at the mechanisms of our own habits.
Exactly. Regardless of whether you agree with the philosophical architecture of this text, or if you find its conclusions deeply offensive and dangerous, it forces a reflection. Think about your own life. Are there areas where you act like the thinker? Do you ever sacrifice your own immediate physical comfort, skip the party, ignore the trends to focus relentlessly on a higher, long-term goal?
Or conversely, do you find yourself falling into the kaleidoscopic existence the text attributes to the primitives, chasing the next distraction, the next fast food meal, the next burst of endorphins, plugging your metaphorical kettle into a socket you don't understand without any unifying purpose?
It's a harsh lens to look through. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final, unaddressed paradox to mull over on your own. It's something that builds on this source material, but frankly, it struck me as a massive contradiction in the author's logic.
Oh, what's the paradox?
Well, the text paints the thinker as this transcendent, unparalleled genius, a being whose mind operates on a level that the rest of humanity simply cannot fathom. They can calculate orbital physics, decode dead languages, and conceptually optimize entire societal infrastructures. They are the ultimate intellectual force.
Unmatched cognitive ability, according to the text, yeah.
Right. But if the thinker's intellect is truly that superior, and their ultimate stated goal is to optimize the world for everyone, shouldn't they be smart enough to figure out a way to communicate?
Oh, that's a good point.
Shouldn't a true transcendent genius be able to crack the code of human empathy, bridge the gap, and elevate the people around them, rather than just retreating into anger, isolation, and fantasies of authoritarian control?
Connecting that to the bigger picture, it really raises a fundamental question about the nature of intelligence itself. Is raw intellect, stripped entirely of empathy and human connection, actually optimal? Or is it just another kind of limitation?
Exactly. Is a genius who can't talk to their neighbor truly a genius? It's something to think about the next time you are standing on that busy city street corner, looking at the crowd, and wondering exactly what kind of world we're all building together. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.